guidelines that mean 65 and so forth, but ultimately it may not be true for all patients, and we very well know. So the first lesson learned that hemodynamically stable as far as blood pressure is concerned, it not necessarily hemodynamically normal or adequate or optimized. So the target of only blood pressure not suffice in all patients. Second is to high CVP means patient doesn't need fluid. CVP denotes or reflects intravascular volume status, and CVP can be used as marker of fluid responsiveness. Let's see again clinical scenarios if we are measuring CVP, or just to understand. CVP 10, BP 80 systolic. So adequate CVP, but BP 80 systolic. Should I give fluid? Vasopressors. CVP low, BP okay. That means patient doesn't require fluid, or should we decrease fluid? CVP 6, a bit low, but BP 90 systolic. So fluid bolus or increase rate or decrease rate, or CVP very high, but BP 80 systolic. So should we stop fluid and start vasopressors? So and so forth. There are lots and lots of fallacies in CVP monitoring. You see this, we measure CVP here somewhere, at this juncture, and we take this as a reflection of left ventricular end diastolic volume and pressure. We see that, okay, this reflects this, but there's lots of interaction and lots of pathophysiological going on, phenomena going on in between. So we actually, there are lots of assumption that if left ventricular end diastolic volume is equal to left ventricular end diastolic pressure, that we assume. So we assume that, kind of normal LV compliance. The same way, left atrial pressure and left ventricular end diastolic pressure, that means normal mitral valve. If we are using pulmonary artery catheter, if LAP is equal to PAOP, means PAC in good lung zone, that is 3. PAOP is equal to PADP, that is normal vascular resistance of pulmonary vessels, and CVP is equal to LAP, that means parallel function of RV and LV. So there are lots and lots of assumptions in CVP monitoring as an indirect way or surrogate marker of adequacy of preload. Actually, it is not true, and I won't go into detail of errors of measurement right from positioning to confounding factors. And there is enough literature that prediction of fluid responsive, it is as good as not more than 50%. Like our clinical decision making, it is like toss of a coin. So second lesson learned, that CVP does not reflect intravascular volume status as well as fluid responsiveness. What about the third thing, per hour urine output monitoring? Now we know it is a delayed indicator. It is a good marker of perfusion, but a delayed indicator of perfusion, that if the adequacy is right now or inadequacy is right now, it reflects after some time. So we can't rely on patients with AKI. We can't rely on patients who are on diuretics, and there is no role in patients with CKD. So all these three markers, third lesson learned, that we cannot rely on urine output monitoring. So all three markers we cannot utilize because of better understanding of hemodynamics in a straight way or in a accurate way. So can advanced hemodynamic monitoring help us? Of course, yes. And first and foremost, I won't go into much of detail because of the standardization of practice of getting arterial lactate, that it is hemodynamic parameter, perfusion parameter. Higher lactate suggests poor perfusion, and at the same time, lactate clearance suggests adequacy, probable adequacy of fluid resuscitation and tissue perfusion. So yes, we can definitely use this hemodynamic marker in our day-to-day practice because it matters, barring the confounding factors that we must understand. And other hemodynamic parameters that I will just go in brief. There are static parameters and dynamic parameters. I will not go into great depth. Probably my next speaker might go into detail, but we must understand each and every static parameter and dynamic parameter. You see that ROC is 0.5 to 0.6 for static and 0.7 to 0.8 of dynamic parameters. And there are lots and lots of equipments or gadgets available. First and foremost is sonography. That is also a part of now hemodynamic monitoring, very important part of hemodynamic monitoring. And if available, cardiac output monitoring devices, either calibrated or uncalibrated. And just take a glimpse of few points that taking a probe in our hand is, that means we are combining our hemodynamic monitoring with our clinical decision making. First and foremost, we need to find out clinically that, okay, this patient is hemodynamically unstable and requiring fluid or not, or patient might be fluid responsive or not. And that can be clubbed with our, hemodynamic parameter. And first and foremost, nothing better than IVC, but there are definite few prerequisites that patient has to be on mechanical ventilation with enough tidal volume, and we have to have absence of kind of confounding factors like intra-abdominal hypertension, which can directly affect the IVC collapsibility or distensibility. If we can use distensibility collapsibility index routinely, definitely it can club or help us in triggering factor for starting of fluid resuscitation. And there are lots and lots of hemodynamic monitoring cardiac output parameters available. But what we want to know, like few SVV, that is stroke volume variation, systolic pressure variation, pulse pressure variation, and maybe extravascular lung water. So let's go through one by one briefly. It's beyond the scope of this lecture to go into great depth, but whatever monitor we use, we must understand what we are using this monitor for. It's not the number, but the interpretation and intervention based on that interpretation which matters rather than absolute value. So if we use any of the monitor, if we get stroke volume variation, higher the stroke volume variation, that means probably patient might be preload responsive or fluid responsive. There are PICO catheters and LIDCO catheters. It is actually a transpulmonary thermodilution. We need to literally do it. And the systolic area under systolic curve until diacritic notch is been, it's kind of pulse contour analysis, but calibration is definitely required. And what we get, all the parameters that I already narrated. The same way LIDCO plus, actually external calibration with lithium every 8 hours is necessary, and it helps us in monitoring the same kind of parameters. As I said, stroke volume variation, systolic pressure variation, higher the variation, that means probably patient is fluid responsive and patient may be having intravascular volume depletion. One of the good gadget is, volume view parameters, and it utilizes Priestley criteria for an acceptable percentage of error of less than 30%. I won't go into much of detail, it's in a lecture by its own, but we get lots and lots of parameters with a fancy screen, which also depicts, on what is going on, right? I'm not going into detail of, the central venous oxygen monitoring because of lots of fallacies recently in few years that it doesn't accurately, it may not accurately reflect the tissue perfusion, but yes, it may be one of the parameter that we can utilize along with this monitor. So we get, stroke volume variation, systemic vascular resistance index, global ejection fraction, extravascular lung water over and above cardiac index, and stroke volume variation. At the same time, if we keep on giving fluid, then it literally depicts right from our nurse's point of view also. You see that higher the extravascular lung water, and this kind of figure comes up on the screen, which suggests that stop fluid and probably patient might require some form of diuretic. For further going up, I won't go again into much of detail as far as this PLR is concerned, but it is an important hemodynamic tool without any fancy gadget or I would say more external fluid. It is kind of auto fluid challenge, but please remember, we have to have cardiac output monitoring for that. And it's not like change in blood pressure or change in heart rate or something like that. After PLR, we have to monitor cardiac output, and most of the literature suggests that the response to PLR is, can be better assessed also with non-invasive cardiac output monitoring. One of the other gadget, esophageal Doppler, we can have this kind of graph and see this. I won't go into detail, but see the type of the graph, the contour of the graph itself suggests whether patient is hypovolemic, patient is in left ventricular failure, or patient is having higher afterload, and we may need maybe fluid, maybe inotrope, or maybe we need to have some vasodilator therapy. And this kind of tool are for ongoing monitoring and trigger, but we need to have some later on safety indicator also, when to stop. So to start with, USG probe is necessary. To end with also USG probe is necessary, that by doing lung ultrasound and checking of B lines, monitoring of B lines, and following the false protocol, actually we can literally see that patient is going into probably volume overload. We can stop fluid, and if necessary, probably we may administer diuretic therapy as well. So any kind of acute circulatory failure, early phase of sepsis, definitely fluid is the first thing that we always give. You just see this, whether patient is having arrhythmia, patient is having spontaneous breathing or low tidal volume or low lung compliance. If it is no, patient is on mechanical ventilation, any of these parameters, including an expiratory occlusion test, which is from Indian origin article, that also can be utilized. But if any of this is there, still there is a reasonable predictability with either PLR or an expiratory occlusion test, or maybe mini fluid challenge we may have in subsequent lecture. So just to conclude, cardiovascular failure is common phenomena in sepsis. Blood pressure is equal to cardiac output is actually a totally myth, I would say. Targeting mean arterial pressure 65 is okay to start with, but we must remember it may not be true in each and every patient. We need to select either fluid vasopressure very, very carefully. We need to know intravascular volume status and fluid responsiveness. CVP doesn't guide us accurately. It is as good as toss of a coin. And we need to take help of many advanced hemodynamic monitoring tools over and above our clinical skills. Whatever monitor we use, ultimately we must know the limitations of each and confounding factors. Ultrasound should be our supplementary stethoscope now, but I would say rather than supplementary, it has kind of replaced the conventional stethoscope. And bedside assessment and monitoring is the key. But if we use monitors, then it's nothing like minimal invasive. Each and every monitor is having some form of invasiveness. Each and every monitor is having some source of error. So one must know the limitations. Most of the studies have compared these monitors with PAC in hemodynamically stable patients. Now, pulmonary artery catheter is out, but we must respect pulmonary artery catheter because majority of the understanding of hemodynamic monitoring had come through PAC only. So information regarding their impact on clinical outcome is scarce. So, dear friends, in bed administration, there are 4 things: indicator that leading us to start fluid, predictor that is judgment that this strategy will be fluid responsive or not, target to achieve with fluids, what are our targets, and safety that we can't go beyond or it may be harmful otherwise. So in all 4 parameters, understanding of hemodynamics definitely change our bedside clinical practice as far as using any of those monitors is concerned. So it helps us in whether to give fluids, to stop fluids. It tells us no room for fluids, start vasopressors, at times to start inodilators, to titrate vasopressors, and to give diuretics or de-escalate fluid therapy. See, any of these things can be, we can have supplemental decision to any of these parameters that already say. But remember, no monitoring device, no matter how simple or complex, invasive or non-invasive, inaccurate or precise, will improve outcome. No monitor is connected directly to outcome, but we must interpret, and our intervention out of our interpretation which can improve outcome, and not the just monitoring and having fancy gadget itself. So any of the monitor may be like this. See, this GPS says that turn left. So we must know that there is no left way. So all of any gadget cannot replace our clinical judgment. So we have to keep our eyes and opens. We cannot treat numbers, but we are treating our patients. So yes, these are supplementary to our clinical decision making. I hope I am clear with this. Thank you for patient listening.
So thank you, Dr. Hitesh, for a nice lecture. I think we will keep the question and answer session for the end of all 3 lectures.
Sure.
So I would like to invite Dr. Kamalpreet Sodhi. She's a good friend of mine, and apart from the editor of one of the wonderful book on CRRT and dialysis renal replacement therapy, which is an ISCCM flagship book. She's also co-editors of multiple journals, including Critical Care Communications. And she's a passionate teacher, I know. And welcome, Kamal, for delivering us a lecture which is very close to my heart, fluid stewardship, how, when, and how.
Thank you, sir, for the introduction. And I would rather say, like, you are the master of fluid therapy. Whatsoever we have learned over years, it's from the masters only. So I'm happy to share my experience and talk about like something which is close to your heart. So I'll be talking about fluid stewardship, why, when, and how. In continuation with Dr. Ritesh's talk, actually we all know IV fluids are the most common drugs administered in the ICU. But despite the use, we must know that IV fluids are not benign. They have significant risk factors as enumerated by Dr. Ritesh also: hypovolemia associated with decreased organ perfusion, ischemia, and multi-organ failure, and hypervolemia and volume overload per se associated with organ dysfunction, delayed liberation from mechanical ventilation, increased ICU stay, and increased mortality. So fluid stewardship, it's basically a comprehensive multi-dimensional concept. The aim is to optimize the clinical outcomes, minimizing the unintended consequences of IV fluid administration. And it involves the 4 rights. That's the right patient, right drug, right route, and right dose. Obviously, while monitoring the fluid therapy. Fluids maximally in the ICUs are used for the sepsis. We all know, we are dealing day in, day out. That's our bread and butter. And sepsis has been said to be the 3rd leading cause of death in the US, but not only in the US. The study of intensive care units, the case mix and practice pattern study, which came just last week, the NDCAPS 2 study, it also says that up to 29% of Indian patients had sepsis during the ICU stay. And in sepsis, what had been recommended in 2016 sepsis guidelines was the 1-hour bundle. 1-hour bundle, which says that for the initial resuscitation for sepsis and septic shock patients, we have to begin immediately all these maneuvers. And one of them was to begin rapidly administer 30 mils per kg of fluid for hypotension or lactate more than 4 millimoles per liter. So this 30 mils per kg in 1 hour, large volume fluid resuscitation, obviously. This is actually an accepted clinical practice, but increasing concern over the potential harm, both from rapid fluid administration and also subsequently positive fluid balance, which we term as the fluid overload. This has influence on the patient outcomes. So fluid overload, how we define is a cutoff value of 10% of fluid accumulation. That fluid accumulation is like cumulative fluid balance divided by the baseline body weight of a patient into 100. So percentage, once we calculate, like we have a 50 kg patient and the cumulative fluid balance over last 3 or 4 days is around 5 liters. That comes out to be 10%. That's the percentage fluid accumulation. If it's more than that, that we term as fluid overload. So if we give too much of fluid, the cardiac output reduces, which causes less of tissue perfusion, venous pressure increases, vessel walls are damaged, thereby fluid leak, leading on to edema and reduced organ perfusion, and ultimately leading on to multi-organ failure, increased length of stay. So this fluid overload is a vicious circle. When we have a hypovolemic patient, we fluid resuscitate, leading on to intestinal edema. There's a visceral swelling, leading on to intra-abdominal hypertension, causing oliguria, wherein we again give fluids to treat that. Also, increased intra-abdominal pressures lead on to mesenteric vein compression, venous hypertension is there, or again, we go in for more fluids. So this vicious cycle continues. And what we land up is into this fluid overload, affecting almost all the organs in the body. The CNS leading on to cerebral edema, there's increased intracranial pressure, increased intraocular pressure, cardiovascular dysfunction is there, the renal parameters, they get deranged. We have renal interstitial edema, decreased renal blood flow, and ultimately leading on to acute kidney injury. The abdominal wall issues are there, the gastrointestinal gut edema occurs, there's increased ileus, the bowel contractility decreases, splanchnic microcirculatory flow decreases. Also, the hepatic congestion and cholestasis might occur with fluid overload, and the crux being the respiratory failure because of the increased pulmonary edema, increased pleural effusion occurs. There's extravascular lung water, and ultimately leading on to prolonged ventilation, difficult weaning, which all culminates into sort of a multi-system organ failure. So positive fluid balance. Actually, this is all theoretical, but does it certainly worsens the morbidity and mortality? Let's see what the literature says. There's enormous literature present about fluids and across, but this we talk about the fluid volume and the fluid balance. This was a systematic review published in 2018, which said that this was a review of around 15 studies involving more than 31,000 patients. And it said that high fluid balance, they have a 70% increased risk of mortality. And the fluid volume administered in the first 24 hours was higher for the non-survivors. So certainly high fluid balance is bad. There's another Cochrane review of around only 4 studies, that too in children. It showed that liberal fluid therapy increases mortality amongst children, both in hospital as well as up to 4 weeks in the follow-up. This systematic review included 11 RCTs and multiple observational interventional studies, and it again showed that a cumulative fluid balance after 1 week of ICU stay was around 4.4 liters more in the non-survivors. Certainly, so a positive cumulative fluid balance is associated with intra-abdominal hypertension and worse outcomes. And this was the first study by Malbranne in 2014, which actually came up with the concept of de-resuscitation, wherein they said that in patients not transgressing spontaneously from ebb flow to flow phases of shock, the patients who are not spontaneously recovering, late conservative fluid management and late goal-directed fluid removal should be considered. So the de-resuscitation term came after this study came up. The SOAP investigators, this was a 24 European society countries study covering 198 ICUs, and it again showed huge study, which showed that a positive fluid balance increased mortality up to 60 days. The multicentric FACT trial, including 1,000 patients with acute lung injury or ARDS, it again showed that conservative strategy group experienced faster improvement in lung function, and there were fewer days on ventilation and intensive care unit, but showed no mortality benefit with a conservative therapy. This study, which came up just last year, again, this included 9 trials published in the last 5 years, and no statistically difference was seen in the lower versus higher fluid volumes. What about sepsis? There are multiple studies which have come up which showed that positive fluid balance is a major predictor of clinical outcomes in patients with sepsis and septic shock, increasing both the mortality, the length of stay. So do we still think that 30 mils per kg to be given over 1 hour is okay? Why we want to give it? I think we should say that this is complete and utter madness. And this actually has been accepted by the Surviving Sepsis guidelines also, which came up last week only, which have changed their guidelines from recommendation to a suggestion that for patients with sepsis-induced hypoperfusion or septic shock, they suggest only, not recommend, that at least 30 mils per kg of IV crystalloid fluid should be given within the first 3 hours of resuscitation. Yes, resuscitation during early stages is very much required. We'll talk about in the later half of this talk. So IV fluids have been in clinical use over almost a century, but it's very recently that the medical community has actually begun to appreciate the importance of judicious fluid administration. And judicious fluid administration is all about fluid stewardship. But the concept first into clinical practice came up after this paper by Malbranne. He introduced this concept of fluid stewardship. This is a beautiful review, which we all must go through, wherein he talked about the 4 Ds and the 4 phases of fluid therapy. So fluid stewardship is all about the 4 Ds and 4 phases. What are the 4 Ds? The drug, dose, duration, de-escalation. IV fluids are to be treated like drugs. And all drugs which have to be given, we need to have a dose of the drug, the duration, the de-escalation has to be planned. So if we talk about a drug, we ought to know when to start, when to stop, and when to start removal of that drug and when to stop the removal. So this is all about the IV fluid. There are certain myths about fluid therapy which we all must keep in mind, that all septic patients are not hypovolemic. All surgical patients too are not hypovolemic. We need not keep on infusing fluids into them. And also low preload does not always mean that we have to give more fluids. Similar is the case like with edema. It's not necessary that we have to administer diuretics. So all these myths, we have to come out of these. Actually, fluids in sepsis and ICU, we all know no starches, no gelatins. Even the sepsis guidelines 2021, they have actually given up on gelatins also, which was previously a suggestion that we might use gelatins, but no starches, no gelatins, and no large amounts of abnormal saline. I'll say this is not normal saline, this is abnormal saline. And we know obviously no glucose 5%, but yes, balanced crystalloids, blood, and especially in cases of this hemorrhagic shock, and albumin might be used in later stages. So fluid strategy is more important than the fluid per se. Even the Surviving Sepsis campaign 2021, they have come out of this, that they suggested that using either balanced crystalloids or saline for fluid resuscitation. Now the suggestion is using balanced crystalloids instead of normal saline. So the normal saline has to be ruled out. So the question is now when to start fluids. Actually, Dr. Ritesh has very nicely enumerated that when to start fluids, how to use the hemodynamics monitoring, especially to start fluids. But we must keep in mind that there are basically 4 indications for starting fluid: the resuscitation, maintenance, replacement, and nutrition. So resuscitation fluids basically should focus on rapid correction of circulating blood volume. The concept is to correct the IV fluid deficit or to treat the acute hypovolemia per se. And basic aim is to certainly to save the lives. And next comes the maintenance fluids. The maintenance fluids which we must deliver the basic electrolytes and glucose that's needed for the daily metabolic needs of the body. They are the maintenance fluids. The next indication is the replacement fluids. They're basically to correct the existing or developing deficits that cannot be compensated usually by the oral intake alone. So we need to give IV fluids as replacement fluids. The replacement fluids ideally are isotonic balanced crystalloids, and they must match the amount and composition of fluids and electrolytes as closely as possible to the fluid being lost. So they are the replacement fluids. Like for the GI losses that we talk about, we know the gastric fluid is a chloride-rich fluid. So that's actually the only indication as of now for use of saline in the ICU. One thing which we usually forget once we talk about the IV fluids in the ICU, the nutritional fluids, which we are using for the enteral or the parenteral nutrition. So we must take into account the nutrition fluids also once we are giving them. This retrospective single center study, this study was done in over more than 14,000 patients. And this came up with certain very good postulates that what we routinely think is that we use fluids mainly for resuscitation and we tend to overload the patient with the resuscitation. Actually, this is not so. This has been after this publication, many other publications have also come up which have showed that contrary to the routine belief, the maintenance and replacement fluids, they are accounting for much larger volume of fluid given to the patients as compared to the resuscitation. Like in this study, the resuscitation fluid being given was only 6% of the daily fluid given as compared to the 25% of the maintenance or the replacement fluid. But another major thing that was more alarming, which came up with this study, was this 33% fluid creep. This was a striking finding of the study. What's fluid creep is the fluids that are administered as drug diluents or to maintain the catheter patency. And this is what we need to, actually, we can clearly come down on this part of the IV fluid therapy. Next to decide is the dose. Paracelsus said that all things are poison and nothing is without a poison. Only the dose permits something to not to be poisonous. So this holds true for IV fluids also, which we are routinely using day in, day out in our ICUs. And very much so because our patients are critically ill with physiological disturbances happening. But as compared to most drugs, in contrast, there's no standard therapeutic dose for the IV fluids which exists. And dose actually refers to both pharmacokinetics and the pharmacodynamics. The volume kinetics and dynamics, actually they depend upon the type of fluid used. When administering like 1 liter of fluid only, the amount of fluid which is held intravascularly will vary. Like we are giving 10% glucose, sorry, if we are giving glucose solution, only 10% will remain intravascular after an hour or so, as compared to isotonic crystalloid solution, of which 25 to 30% will remain in the intravascular space. Of the colloids, almost 100% will be there after an hour. But half-life is also dependent on other conditions, like if there's superadded infection, the inflammation is there, sedation, surgery, patients undergoing general anesthesia, or blood pressure. Actually, what is important to know is that as long as the crystalloids or the colloids are being infused, they'll exert a similar volume extension effect. But the distribution or elimination will be much slowed, especially in cases of shock, in hypotension, or patients undergoing general anesthesia or sedation. So hence, crystalloids have a much better short-term effects in plasma volume than was previously believed. This is what we are seeing in our ICUs. So the dosing considerations before we prescribe the IV fluid, we have to look at the fluid status. That might be that patient is hypovolemic, euvolemic, or hypervolemic. What we want to give, how much we want to give. That will be a clinical judgment, vital signs, the fluid balance charts. We have to look over the fluid balance over the last 24 hours or maybe over last few days. The dynamic and the static parameters, which Dr. Ritesh has already talked about. The patient's weight, which is a good guide about the fluid status, and the patient's urea and electrolytes. Fluid responsiveness, we have already talked about that we have to identify the predictors of fluid responsiveness. That might be the physiological parameters, the static or the dynamic parameters. But what is required is before we start with IV fluids, we must start with a fluid challenge of around 4 mL per kg over 5 minutes, assess the response. And we need to understand that the thresholds to define fluid responsiveness will vary with the parameter. Like we're giving a fluid challenge, a response of 15% will be the fluid responsiveness. If there is 10% with the passive lag raising test, or might be with the end occlusion test and expiratory exclusion test, it will be only around 5%. The natural fluid bolus, we know that PLR we have already talked about. The rationale to assess the fluid responsiveness is to limit the fluid administration to situations where there is at least a possibility of clinical benefit. We should do no harm to the patient. If the patient is not fluid responsive, no fluid therapy is needed. In a recent RCT of lactate versus peripheral perfusion guided fluid resuscitation in sepsis, it was seen that less than 5% of patients were fluid responsive at 8 hours of presentation. And this is actually what happens in our patients. Once we receive the patient from the ER to the ICU, by the time the patient reaches the ICU, the patients are least likely to be fluid responsive. And many studies have shown that the physiological effects of fluid bolus given in ICU, they are very small. And fluid responsiveness is perhaps the exception rather than the rule in the ICU. So we must assess the fluid responsiveness of patients before going in for IV fluid therapy. Coming on to the duration, the next D, that's the duration. Duration of fluid therapy is crucial. Volume must be tapered once the shock is resolved. So stop fluids when they're no longer needed, and the patients can have oral fluids. So starting triggers for fluid resuscitation are quite clear, but clinicians are less aware of stopping triggers for fluid resuscitation. We need to put a stop on the IV fluid therapy. That is very much required. So no fluid response, no more fluids. This is very clear. And the last phase, that's the de-escalation. Let's talk about de-resuscitation. Actually, this is a phase of critical illness after the initial resuscitation and stabilization, characterized by discontinuation of invasive therapies and a transition to a negative fluid balance. This involves a late goal-directed fluid removal, which involves aggressive active fluid removal by means of diuretics or renal replacement therapy with a net ultrafiltration, or a late conservative fluid management, which is defined usually as 2 consecutive days of negative fluid balance within the first week of ICU stay. And these have been said to be independent predictors of survival in ICU patients. So before starting with de-resuscitation, ensure that the indication for fluid resuscitation no longer exists, that the patient is hemodynamically stable, if he or she is not on vasopressors or on minimal vasopressors. Lactate has been cleared and there's adequate venous oxygen saturation. 5 steps should be kept in mind while going in for de-resuscitation. Define a clinical endpoint. Like we should have clear endpoints in mind that what we want to achieve by de-resuscitation. Major being the usually clinical thing used is the improvement in the oxygenation. Set a fluid balance goal, like for example, a liter of negative balance in the 24 hours or so. We have to set like how much negative balance we are targeting. Set perfusion renal safety precautions. Like once we have started with de-resuscitation, patients might go into hypovolemia. So we have to be very sure, we have to look at the renal safety parameters also, like supposedly like 25% increase in the serum creatinine. That will suggest that we have to stop with de-resuscitation also. And reevaluate every 24 hours unless the safety limits are reached. And then accordingly, we have to plan. So when should de-resuscitation begin? Once the fluid overload or the fluid accumulation, it negatively impacts the end organ function. And actually it's mandatory once we have a positive fluid balance in combination with a poor oxygenation, like PF ratios going below 200, there's increased capillary leak with a high PVPI or extravascular lung water index, increase in the intra-abdominal pressure of more than 15 or a low abdominal perfusion pressure of less than 50. So de-escalation, this is the final step in fluid therapy. That's withholding the fluids once they are no longer required, thereby reducing the risk of fluid overload and a related deleterious effect. If we talk about de-escalation, I'll not say that this is the final step. We have to start de-escalation right from the time of admission in the ICU and starting of the IV fluids as we plan for the antibiotics too. De-escalation, Malden had suggested this ROSE model, which is being routinely now used in the ICU, which suggests that ROSE model, their phases of volume therapy is for resuscitation, O is for optimization, S for stabilization and evacuation. So we'll be talking about these phases one by one, but what is important that during resuscitation, we are in the phase, the aim is to rescue the patient. We have to go in for early resuscitation, early adequate fluid management and rescue the patient. O is for organ rescue, like optimization phase, the O focus is on organ rescue. And during the stabilization phase, this is for the organ support. The focus basically, like we might go in for late conservative fluid management, but we have to support the organ. And the last E is for evacuation phase once the focus is on organ recovery and resolving the fluid overload. So during resuscitation, aim of fluid treatment is resuscitation and correction of shock with achievement of an adequate perfusion pressure. During the optimization phase, fluids should be administered according to individual needs and reassessed on a regular basis. That is the optimization. Stabilization phase involves, the aim is to provide water and electrolytes to replace the ongoing losses and provide organ support, and evacuation, removing excess fluid, which will be frequently achieved by spontaneous diuresis as the patient will recover or might need ultrafiltration or the diuretics. So talking about these phases, the resuscitation phase just starts immediately after the first hit. The 4 hits have been defined in this ROSE concept. The first hit is what happens to the patient, like it can be sepsis, it can be pancreatitis or trauma once the patient lands up into the ICU. And this is a life-threatening hit and occurring within minutes. And this phase actually lasts for over few hours only, characterized by low mean arterial pressure, low cardiac output, microcirculatory impairment is there. And what is required is the salvage or the rescue treatment. And IV fluids have to be given quickly as bolus. The goal is adequate goal-directed fluid management, and fluid balance has to be positive during this phase of resuscitation. And the suggested resuscitation targets are the MAP of more than 65, cardiac index of more than 2.5 liters per minute per meter square, or a pulse pressure variation of less than 12, or left ventricular and diastolic area index is more than 8. The next phase is the optimization phase. This is an unstable, uncompensated shock requiring titration of fluids to cardiac output. So once we do the resuscitation, this is the optimization phase has to start once the second hit occurs. That's the ischemia reperfusion injury starts. So here, fluid accumulation can be seen as a biomarker for the severity of illness. So the fluid balance should go from positive to neutral, because at this phase, there is always a risk of polycompartment syndrome or CARS. So the targets of optimization phase are a MAP of more than 65, cardiac index more than 2.5, pulse pressure variation less than 14, LVDE is 8 to 12 centimeters, intra-abdominal pressure less than 15, or the abdominal perfusion pressure of more than 55. The next phase is the stabilization phase, which evolves over days. This is the hemostasis phase and focusing on, as we have previously talked, the organ support. There is no shock as such and no imminent threat of shock is there. So fluid therapy in this phase is only for the normal maintenance and replacement. So we have to monitor the daily body weight, fluid balance, the organ function, and we might go in for late conservative fluid management, aiming for a 0 or a negative fluid balance. And the targets are the extravascular lung water index of less than 10 to 12, the PVPI of less than 2.5, IAP of less than 15, abdominal perfusion pressure of more than 55, or the colloid osmotic pressure of more than 16 to 18 millimeters mercury, or a CLI of less than 60. The last phase is the evacuation phase. This occurs over days in the later phase. This is actually important in patients, especially those who do not spontaneously recover. Rather, they do not transit from ebb phase to flow phase. And herein they develop the third hit, that is the global increased permeability syndrome, with ongoing fluid accumulation due to capillary leak and fluid overload leading on to organ and organ dysfunction. So goal here is to promote a negative fluid balance, and most probably by mobilizing accumulated fluids with late goal-directed fluid removal. We have to de-resuscitate. And the motto here is dry lungs are happy lungs. So we have to avoid over-enthusiastic fluid removal. That is the aim. We should have in mind that we should not go in removing the fluid unduly, because this over-enthusiastic fluid removal will ultimately lead on to the fourth hit, that is the hypoperfusion and tissue hypoxia. So what we are going to monitor, as Dr. Ritesh has said, we need to know what we are monitoring, in which phase, what are the targets of monitoring, and accordingly we have to plan our fluids per se. This PAL treatment, this has been recommended. This is actually now being used in many ICUs. And this was a pilot study looking at the effects of PAL treatment in patients with acute lung injury and increased intra-abdominal pressure, combining high PEEP, 20% albumin, and Lasix for fluid removal or ultrafiltrate during CRRT. So this effect was seen as lower and extravascular lung water index, lower IAP, and lower cumulative fluid balance compared to the control patients. Also, the control patients, the study group had a shorter duration of mechanical ventilation and ICU stay and lower 28-day mortality. Another study by radar investigators, it also showed, this study was done on over 400 patients and showed that fluid balance on day 3 was an independent risk factor for 30-day mortality, and negative fluid balance achieved with de-resuscitation on day 3 of ICU stay. It improved the outcome. So the conclusion was that minimization of day 3 fluid balance by limiting maintenance fluid intake and drug diluents using de-resuscitative Myers, it represents a potential beneficial therapeutic strategy. So we might go in further. Another meta-analysis of 11 randomized controlled trials again showed no difference in mortality, but certainly they showed that conservative or de-resuscitative fluid strategy resulted in increased number of mechanical ventilator-free days and decreased length of ICU stay. This was a study of 364 patients wherein a protocol-driven diuresis was used, and a protocolized diuresis was associated with significant decrease in 72 hours post-shock cumulative fluid balance. The in-hospital mortality was much lower, 5.5% versus 16% in the standard care group. And there were higher ICU free days with the protocolized diuresis group. This forced fluid removal in AKI patients, this was done with furosemide and or continuous renal replacement therapy and aiming a net negative fluid balance of more than 1 mL per kg per hour until cumulative fluid balance calculated from ICU admission less than 1 liter. And this again showed that there was a marked reduction in cumulative fluid balance 5 days after randomization in the study group, although this was a very study with a very low inclusion rate. Actually, it was stopped prematurely because only 2% of the 100, this 1144 screen patients, they participated in they could be included in the study. This RADAR2, this study is on, and this I had just included because I found it like this is a very good protocol which can be routinely followed in our ICUs for planning de-resuscitation, wherein indapamide and spironolactone 100 milligram is given as enteral and up to 40 milligram of furosemide IV bolus on the first day of de-resuscitation. This is the study protocol. And thereafter, furosemide infusion is started at around 5 milligram per hour. And after every 6 hours, the checks are done. If the net 6-hour fluid balance is less than 250 milligram ml negative, like after starting this infusion, if less than 250 mils is the negative balance, then we have to double the furosemide infusion rate. If there is 250 to 750 mils of negative fluid balance over the 6 hours, then continue with the current regime. And if there is higher amount of negative fluid balance, more than 750 mils in 6 hours, then we have to half the furosemide dose, that is around 2.5 milligram per hour. So this can be routinely used in our ICUs, like how we do it. So the recommendations per se is that a goal of 0 to negative fluid balance by day 3 and to keep a cumulative fluid balance on day 7 as low as possible. And diuretics or renal replacement therapy in combination with albumin can be used to mobilize fluids in hemodynamically stable patients with intra-abdominal hypertension. And a positive cumulative fluid balance after acute resuscitation has been completed and the source control has been addressed. This was a survey done in 524 critical care specialists in UK, and they believed 85% of them thought that fluid overload is a modifiable source of morbidity. And there was a strong support up to 86% for a randomized trial of de-resuscitation and critical illness. So this is the time when we should accept de-resuscitation or fluid stewardship into our clinical practice. This is a beautiful review article wherein they have said that fluid therapy is a double-edged sword during critical care. Yes, we need to reduce the fluid overload, starting from the time of resuscitation. No excessive fluids during resuscitation phase, no fluid without fluid responsiveness. Avoid fluids if the risk is too high during stabilization. We have to look at the fluid balance, the weight gain, the lung water, intra-abdominal pressures, or the CVP. And in the later phases, we have to remove fluid. How much we are going to remove, that we have already talked about, that we need to look at certain parameters and remove the fluid accordingly. So fluid stewardship is a series of coordinated interventions introduced to select the optimal fluid, dose, and duration of therapy that results in the best clinical outcome, prevention of adverse events, and cost reduction. So we have to practice fluid stewardship as we practice the antibiotics. So antibiotic stewardship and the fluid stewardship, they have the analogy, like we have to avoid inappropriate therapy and go in for appropriate therapy, like what all fluids we need to give and what not to use, like don't use glucose as resuscitation fluid. We have to keep in mind the fluid balance, the fluid overload. Combination therapy might be in certain situations, and which class of fluid we want to use, hypo or hypertonic, high load, high chloride or low chloride. As I said, that in GI losses, we should prefer the high chloride fluids, and we might use some colloids during hemorrhagic shock as an appropriate timing. Like in refractory shock, longer the delay, more is the microcirculatory hypoperfusion. So during resuscitation, yes, we have to give more fluids. Also, same applies to the dosing. Analogous to the antibiotics, we have to keep the pharmacokinetics in mind. We have discussed that for how much time a particular fluid stays in the intravascular compartment. We have to look at the distribution volume, the osmolality, or the kidney function, and the pharmacodynamics and the toxicity of all fluids have to be kept in mind. Appropriate duration, no strong evidence, but trend is towards the shorter duration of fluid therapy. And we must not use fluids to treat low CVP, as Dr. Ritesh has also highlighted, that always low CVP doesn't mean we have to give fluids low MAP or the urine output. So we have to use fluids to treat the shock, not to treat the particular parameters per se. And we have to treat to response. The fluids can be stopped once the shock resolves. And de-escalation, we have to plan for de-escalation right from the time we start with IV fluid therapy, and the later stages certainly with late conservative fluid management or the goal-directed fluid management. So to conclude, remember the 4 Ds of fluid therapy, 4 phases and time course of septic shock, that is the ROSE concept, and keeping in mind that each phase requires a different therapeutic attitude regarding fluid administration. So key strategies being minimization of resuscitation fluid, early use of vasopressors, minimizing prescription of maintenance fluids, judicious use of diuretic therapy or RRT to remove excess fluids, and good clinical examination, bedside assessment of cumulative fluid balance using the various dynamic or static parameters, the FiO2 requirements on the bedside, the chest X-ray, biochemistry analysis will certainly help us to switch from resuscitation to the de-resuscitation phase. So IV fluids are not just innocent bags of water, they are drugs, and they are to be treated like drugs. And personalized fluid therapy in the critically ill patients is the need of ours. So a fluid team with fluid stewards, including the doctors, the nurses on the floor, can be planned. Let us not leave the fluid therapy only to our very junior people, especially the medical officers with no experience of intravenous fluid therapy in the sepsis or critically ill patients. And fast hug can be modified to F2, incorporating fluid stewardship as a second F in this fast hug. So this is a useful way to incorporate as a daily component of our ICU care. So remember that the best fluid may be the one that has never been given to the patient. And getting the fluid balance right, that is what fluid stewardship is all about. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sodhi, for the wonderful lecture on fluid stewardship. Again, we would like to take the question and answer at the end of all the 3 lectures. So may I now invite Dr. Rati Bansal Goel. She is the head of critical care 2nd unit at Artemis Hospital. She was trained in Canada in the neurocritical care. And she is a teacher for IFCCM, IDCCM, post-MBBS certificate course, and IDCCM under the edges of Indian Society of Critical Care Medicine. Welcome, Dr. Rati, for the very hot topic on balanced fluid and 0.9% saline.
Thank you,
Dr.
sir.
Rathi.
Thank you for the thank you, sir. Thank you for the opportunity. So after the resuscitation, resuscitation, and the fluid management, I'll be talking about specific fluids. So my topic includes comparison of normal saline to balanced solutions, and does the change of composition of the fluid administered affects the clinical outcome of the patient. The first description of fluids came in the critically ill patient as back as 1830s, when there was a huge cholera outbreak in England. There was a young doctor by the name of Thomas Latta who gave a saline solution to an elderly woman. He administered an IV saline solution.
Ma'am,
And
slide,
he-
please, slide.
Dr. Rathi, please,
slide.
your slide, please.
Right, sir.
You can share your screen.
Okay. 1 second.
Go to the bottom.
Okay. Okay. Is this okay now?
Yeah, fine. You can go to the slide share mode.
Yeah. So is this okay now?
Yeah, first class.
Yeah, so the first description of fluids for resuscitation of a critically ill patient occurred during 1830s when there was a cholera outbreak in England. Thomas Latta, who was a young physician in Leith near Edinburgh, he first gave a solution of saline IV to an elderly woman, and he felt that his eyes lit up and his skin glowed. Normal saline has been used over 50 years in the multitude of clinical situations, whether it is intraoperative, resuscitation, in prescription of drugs, endlessly. Though normal saline is neither normal nor physiological, it has been the standard solution to which all the other solutions have been compared. So why is the discussion for normal salines or balanced solution? The acid-base equilibrium, first described by Henderson-Hasselbalch in critically ill patients, is the core of understanding the acid-base equilibrium in patients. He used 3 factors: bicarbonates, PCO2, solubility of PCO2, and bicarbonic acid to describe the acid-base milieu of the body. And he felt that when we gave normal saline to the patient, it is the dilutional hypercholeremia which caused the decrease in bicarbonates and led towards the acidosis in the patients. In 1983, Stuart brought up another equation describing the same acid-base milieu, and he used plasma carbon dioxide, strong ion difference, and the small anionic charge weak plasma acids to describe the acid-base equilibrium of the body. The strong ion difference consisted of the major cations, which were sodium, chloride, calcium, and magnesium, and chloride and bicarbonate was subtracted from it. The normal SID for a patient was 40 plus minus 2 milliequivalents of liter. Now, when we compare the two fluids, we come to the basic physiology of plasma, where the sodium content is around 140, which is to compare to normal saline, which is 154, and the Plasma-Lyte or the standard balanced solutions like Ringer lactate, which contain from 130 to 140 of sodium. So on normal saline, of course, we are giving a higher sodium load. The chloride also, which is normally 100 in the human body, is 154 in normal saline and 100 to 110 in the balanced solutions. The pH of the human body, as we know, is 7.4. The balanced solutions like Plasma-Lyte A have a pH of 7.4. The normal saline has a pH of 5.5 and the lactated Ringer of 6.5. The osmolality, which is normally 280 to 290 in the human body, is 308 for normal saline compared to 294 to 285 of balanced salt solutions. So what are the possible adverse effects of normal saline? Number 1, the most commonly described adverse effect is the hypercholemic acidosis. Once normal saline is given as a resuscitation fluid, there is a high chloride load in the body. The strong ion difference, as described by the Stuart equation, decreases, and as the strong ion difference decreases, it leads to more acidosis, leading to hypercholemic acidosis. The other important factor that has been described in further studies, as I'll be going to, is the renal dysfunction associated with normal saline. When there is hypercholeremia, increased chloride ions are filtered through the glomeruli. The distal convoluted tubule senses this increased chloride load, which is sensed again by the macula densa. This macula densa then triggers the vasoconstriction of the adjacent afferent arterioles, and hence there is a reduction in GFR, leading to renal dysfunction. There are some other possible harmful effects which have been described with hypercholeremia. The increased chloride levels have been described in terms of splanchnic hypoperfusion. There have been some studies which have been done which have found that there is increased CO2 in the splanchnic cells, and it is probably related to hypoperfusion caused by hypercholeremia. The chloride levels, increased chloride levels, have also been associated with greater blood loss or coagulation abnormalities, though there have been various studies done who have not really concluded any increase in the blood transfusions, but a couple of studies have come out with the fact that there may be some increased transfusion of platelets required on administration of high quantities of normal saline. This is the basic comparison between normal saline and balanced solution. The pH is 5.5 acidic compared to the balanced solutions. The sodium load and chloride load of 154 compared to 130 and 90 of balanced solutions, and the osmolality more in control or in tandem to the plasma for balanced solutions compared to the normal saline. Though the balanced solutions contain acetate, malate, lactate, etc. as their anions. Now, what is the evidence which has led to this discussion with evidence regarding normal saline and balanced solutions? The first trial came as the split trial. This trial was done in New Zealand from April 2014 to October 2014. The clinical question they asked in this trial was whether the critically ill patients developed more acute kidney injury by the use of balanced crystalloid or normal saline. It was a randomized controlled trial which was done in 4 ICUs of New Zealand, out of which 3 were medical and 1 was a surgical ICU. All ICU patients were included in the study. Few with end-stage renal disease, palliative care, or organ donation, etc. were removed from the study. In the end, 2,278 patients were randomized, 1,162 for intervention arm and 116 for the normal saline arm. The end stage was that the acute kidney injury was 102 of 1067 in the balanced group compared to 94 of 1025 in the normal saline group, and the p-value was 0.77. There was no significant difference in the RRT use or oliguria, and there was no significant difference rates in the death in ICU or death in the hospital. So the primary outcomes in terms of AKI or the secondary outcomes in terms of AKI, RRT, mechanical ventilation or mortality all did not show much significance. Following the pitfalls of this study was that it was basically a feasibility study, which hence not powered to evaluate the endpoints. The large cohort of patients, which was about 50%, were post-surgical patients. Then came the SMART trial, which was isotonic solutions and major adverse renal events. Again, the clinical question in this was whether the critically ill patients administered with balanced crystalloids compared with saline reduced the composite endpoint of death, new RRT, or persistent renal dysfunction. It was a randomized controlled trial, and this trial happened in coincidence. It happened along with the SALT ED trial, which they both happened in the same medical center in US. The settings were 5 ICUs of a single medical center, Vanderbilt Medical Center in USA, and of which most of them were medical ICUs and 1 was a surgical ICU. The trial happened from June 2015 to April 2017. Inclusion was all the patients in the ICU above the age of 18, and the exclusion were minor patients. 15,800 patients were randomized, and the patients were well matched at the baseline level. The median age of the patients was around 55 to 60 years of age. The ratio between the male and female sex was more or less the same. The patients received from emergency department were about 50%. The sepsis and septic shock distribution was about 14%, and there was a traumatic brain injury distribution of about 8.8 to 8.5% patients. From the very beginning, the patients who were given normal saline as a resuscitative fluid showed an increased load of chloride from the beginning. In the balanced salt solutions, the bicarbonate levels were a little on the higher side. The patients who were received from emergency department and then went to the ICU came with a higher load of normal saline from day 0. And the bicarbonate levels were more or less same in the balanced and the saline groups. The primary outcome was that the major adverse kidney event within 30 days was found in 14.3% patients in balanced crystalloids compared to 15.4% patients in normal saline group. The p-value was 0.04. Rest of the days in terms of ventilation-free days or mortality or renal replacement therapy were not very significant. The primary outcome of the MAKE-30, as I said, was significant. The secondary outcomes like death before discharge, receive of new RRT, persistent renal dysfunction, they did not show any significant difference, but there were 6 pre-specified subgroup analysis, of which the subgroup of patients with sepsis in hospital mortality was 25.2% in balanced crystalloid group versus 29.4% in the saline group. So the p-value for this was 0.002. Then came the SALT ED trial. This was again the single center randomized trial, same by Vanderbilt University Hospital in USA. The primary outcome kept for this trial were hospital-free days. The sample size was 13,347 and the crystalloid fluids were assigned by the month. The median age was around 55 to 53 for patients. There were about 50% distribution of female sex. The general medicine patients were around 70%. Post-surgical patients were around 19 to 18% and trauma was 3 to 4%. The baseline levels of serum creatinine and electrolytes were well matched. On day 3 or 72 hours after arrival into the emergency department, the patients resuscitated with normal saline showed an increased sodium load, the increasing chloride load, and slight increase in the BUN. The potassium levels remained same as compared to the balanced solutions. There was an increase in the bicarbonate levels in the balanced crystalloids. The serum creatinine was marginally elevated in the normal saline group. The outcome was that in median hospital-free days, it was the same 25 to 25. The in-hospital death mortality was not significant. There was no difference in the new renal replacement therapy. Then there was a meta-analysis which was done in the Annals of Pharmacotherapy 2020 release, and this review in the end showed that resuscitation with balanced crystalloids was associated with lower hospital stay and mortality compared with saline in critically ill adult patients, but not specifically those with sepsis. So the conclusion was that balanced crystalloids should be provided preferentially to saline in most critically ill patients. Now the latest study that has come is the BASICS randomized trial. It is a huge study released recently in JAMA. This study addresses 2 clinical questions relevant to us. Is one, whether the adult intensive care patients does the use of balanced crystalloid compared to 0.9% saline reduce 90-day all-cause mortality, and in adult intensive care, whether the administration of the speed of IV fluids change and bring about any change in mortality. It is a factorial trial with 2x2 randomization. They were randomized into the ratio of 1:1:1. The fluid supplied was marked from A to F. It occurred over a huge setting of 75 ICUs in Brazil. And the data collected was from 29 May 2017 to March 2020. About 11,000 patients were randomized, of which there was an equal distribution in both the saline and the balanced solution group. The saline and balanced solution groups were again further divided into rapid infusion and slower infusion groups. The mean age was around 60 for all patients. There was an equal distribution more or less in the sex ratio. The SOFA score was 4 for most of the patients. There was hypotension in about 55 to 60% of the patients. Invasive mechanical ventilation was required for about 43 to 44% patients. The important thing is that most of the patient had received prior more than 1 liter of fluid prior to randomization. The result was that 90-day mortality in both the groups was more or less same, 26.4% in the BSS group compared to 27.2% in the saline group. The RRT required was again 7.5% in the BSS group, and the normal saline group required 8.1. There was no difference in the mechanical ventilation free days. The significant outcome of this was that in the traumatic brain injury, the patients which received balanced salt solutions showed a mortality of 78 out of 249, that is 31.3%, compared to 21.1% in the normal saline group, which is 0.02 p-value. This is the Fortin's diagram, which shows only a difference in the traumatic brain injury. So the conclusion of the trial was that among patients in intensive care, the use of balanced crystalloid compared to 0.9% sodium chloride did not bring about any reduction in the 90-day mortality. Neither did the use of slower infusion rates when the fluid bolus is required compared to faster rate of infusion did not reduce the 90-day mortality. This trial had various weaknesses. It was mostly lower acuity ICU patients with the Apache score of just 12 and the SOFA score of 4, with nearly 50% of the patients were electively surgical. The median volumes of the trial fluid administered was very low. In the first 24 hours, the fluid administered was only 1.5 liters. In 72 hours, it was only 3 liters. Most of the patients had received fluid prior to randomization. Then came the surviving sepsis guidelines, which were recently released. And these surviving sepsis guidelines give the statement of, for adults with sepsis or septic shock, we recommend using crystalloids. And for adults with sepsis or septic shock, we suggest using balanced crystalloids instead of normal saline for resuscitation. Though this is again a low quality evidence, but it has been a suggestion made clearly into the surviving sepsis guidelines. There is again a large multi-center trial plus, which is awaited. This is happening in 4 ICUs in Australia, and it is comparing balanced solutions with 90-day mortality with saline. So the take-home message is left to our judgment, though why would we selectively want to put the patients through higher sodium loads, higher chloride loads, leading to possibility of more renal replacement therapy requirements and higher mortality. So my take-home message is we lean more towards the balanced salt solutions. Thank you. Zoom का platform.
Hello. Yeah,
Hello, ma'am. Can you hear us?
Yes,
Yeah. Ma'am, have you finished or is still there?
yes, I finished.
Okay, thank you, ma'am. Dr. Ghosh will start.
Saurabh, can you go back to the, can you stop sharing Dr. Bansal's screen?
Ma'am, Ratina, please stop sharing. Ma'am can stop. Yes.
So do you have any questions for the speakers?
They can just type their questions.
So if you have any questions, you can type it in the chat box.
I had a question. Let's type it. Sir, can you see it?
Yeah. So dear sir, madam, what is the validity of hemodynamic parameters of fluid responsiveness in respiratory shock like sepsis? Should we use these parameters for fluid responsiveness actually as parameters for fluid unresponsiveness? Is there any way to differentiate between fluid responsiveness and vasopressor responsiveness in septic shock? So Dr. Ritesh, would you like to answer this question of Dr. Saurabh?
Anyone, sir?
Dr. Ritesh is with us? Okay. Saurabh, Ritesh is with us or?
I think he's not.
Okay,
there.
that's a very interesting question. So that's a very interesting question. What is the validity of hemodynamic parameters of fluid responsiveness in vasodilatory shock? So if you wish, I can
Yes.
share my thoughts on this.
Yes, sir. Please. Please, sir.
So, there are two studies I know. One was from a Dutch study, another was a French study, where they wanted to see whether these fluid responsiveness tests are applicable in an ICU, routine ICU patients. And all the majority of these tests have got a lot of fallacies and a lot of limitations. And after removing those limitations, they could apply test of fluid responsiveness in only 2% of the ICU patients, 2%. So, for example, a large majority of our ICU patients, they may not be ventilated. If they are ventilated, they are on low tidal volume strategy. And even if this Dr. Sheila's paper came up, still low tidal volume strategy or poor lung compliance or having some arrhythmias, you can't avoid it. So this is my first point, that fluid responsiveness, whether it is applicable and how many percentage of patients. Now, regarding fluid responsiveness, or shall we say fluid unresponsiveness, that's an interesting point. Yes, we can say if the fluid responsive patient is actually shown to be fluid responsive after doing this study, that does not automatically mean we need to give fluid. Yes, but we can clearly say that, of course, we should not give fluid to these patients if the patients are fluid unresponsive. So I partially agree with your point that fluid unresponsiveness is a good way of telling. If the patient is not fluid responsive, don't give fluid. Or is there any differentiation between fluid responsiveness and vasopressor responsiveness? This is a very relevant topic. Now, to limit, I'll just add on to what Dr. Sodhi has told, discussed at length about the limitations of our fluid. How can we reduce our fluid intake? one way of reducing our fluid intake is to start vasopressor as early as possible. If you start norepinephrine early, that norepinephrine has a venopressor effect. The venopressor effect of norepinephrine can actually improve the mean systolic filling pressure and actually increase the venous pressure. At the same time, norepinephrine can reduce the requirement of fluid at all. So, and this is one point. And second point is there is a concept of vasopressor challenge. So if your patient is not fluid responsive, or your patient is has actually received a lot of fluid, or you are unable to give fluid to these patients, you start vasopressors. And if your after starting your vasopressor, his capillary refill time or other perfusion parameters are not increasing, you transiently increase the vasopressor in such a way so that you increase the mean arterial pressure maybe from 60 to 65 to maybe around 80 to 85. And you again check the CRT, capillary refill time, or other parameters of perfusion and see whether it is improving. If the patient's perfusion improves with this increase in the mean arterial pressure temporarily, then you should go ahead with this type of this target, maybe 80 to 85 for a longer period of time. If the patient is not responding, means even after increasing your mean arterial pressure, peripheral perfusion is not increasing, you can go back to 60 to 65. So instead of giving fluid, you can actually give some vasopressor challenge. And if the patient improves, in fluid, you can't remove it so easily. But in vasopressor, you can easily taper it off. And this strategy has been shown clearly in the Andromeda shock trial, and particularly in the patients who are hypertensive. And in Andromeda shock 2 trial, which are going to be started in 2022, and fortunately or unfortunately, we are one of the centers. And so this is also going to test the similar type of scenario. I hope that answers your question, Dr. Saurabh.
Yes, sir. Thank you. Thank you so much.
So what is your trigger for starting albumin in septic shock, continuing to be fluid responsive? Any doctors, Pawan, do you want to answer this question? Dr. Rati, anyone would like to answer this question? Pawan is also not there.
Yeah, there it is. Dr. Kunal, there it is.
Is there?
Yeah, they're here.
Dr. Sodhi, would you like to answer this question? Okay, to cut the story short, albumin regarding septic shock resuscitation, albumin has got twofold role. The first role is albumin is safe. That has been clearly shown by our landmark safe study from the Australia New Zealand group, the NGIGS group. But albumin compared to 0.9% saline, I would still not like to call it an abnormal saline. 0.9% saline, because even plasma light and ringer lactate, they are also not normal. They are absolutely abnormal. We don't have so much of acetate in our body, and neither do we have gluconate or lactate. So this is also not perfectly normal. So, but yes, it is more physiological maybe. But albumin compared to 0.9% saline, 4% albumin is not better at least. But albumin has got some role when we use albumin in a hyperoncotic solution, 20% or 25% albumin. If you give it, it can probably have a role in reducing your overall fluid balance. Overall fluid, you give this has been investigated by the Australian group by a study called SWIPE study, which was published somewhere in 2018 or 19, I think 2019. In SWIPE study, they gave 20 or 25% albumin to septic shock patients once they have received a liter of fluid. So in that way, by giving hyperoncotic albumin, they could reduce the overall fluid balance. But this strategy needs to be seen in a larger study and in more patients with septic shock. So these are the two roles which albumin has got. I hope, Saurabh, it answers your question. So Anirban
No,
has
sir.
asked a question on, dear sir, madam, most of ICU patients are not ideal for relying upon heart-lung interaction for judging fluid responsiveness. Now, I was talking about the same thing. I agree, Anirban. 2% of the patients only are fluid responsive in our, as per this traditional criteria. How often do you use PLR in your clinical decision making? Do you use VTI measurements if you don't have cardiac output monitoring device in your ICU? Dr. Ritesh Shah is there with us. Dr. Ritesh Shah is there with us, Saurabh?
He should be there. Dr. Kanwal can answer this question. She is there.
Dr. Sodi, would you like to answer this question? Kanwal?
Then Platinum, can you answer? Do you want to answer this question?
Sorry.
Do you want to answer this question, ma'am?
I'm sorry, I didn't get the question. Can you tell me again, please?
Yeah, the question is, Dr. Anirban Bhattacharya has asked this
Yes,
question.
sir. Yes, sir.
Whether most of the ICU patients are not ideal for relying upon the heart-lung interaction for judging fluid responsiveness. In that case, how often do you use PLR in your clinical decision making? And do you use, he has got a second part of the question, do you use VTI measurements if you don't have cardiac output monitoring device in your ICU?
In hemodynamically unstable patients, patients having cardiac arrhythmias mostly, most of the critically ill patients have some kind of arrhythmia going on or the other. And PLR we have tried in a few percentage of patients, but it doesn't really work out very well for the cardiac output monitoring. The VTI, I won't be able to tell you much.
Okay, so I'll just elaborate it a little bit. Yes, PLR is a great one, but in the absence of cardiac output monitoring, the validity of other tests are probably not very great. But two things, yes, VTI is one, but measuring VTI in a dynamic way, it may not be feasible all the time, but it is one option. More validated one, probably in a ventilated patient, is you go ahead with a capnography and look for the capnograph. If the capnograph is showing a 5% increase in the EtCO2 value, this is an indication for the PLR response. This is validated by our good friend Xavier Monet and his colleagues. And another way is, of course, poor people like us, most of us, at least for me, we don't have cardiac output monitoring devices. So one, not great, but one way is to look for the change in the pulse pressure. Change in the pulse pressure. This has got a sensitivity and specificity of around 68% or 70% for both sensitivity and specificity. If you see a change in the pulse pressure with a PLR maneuver, or the reduction in the pulse pressure variation, that is also one other way. But again, the validity is not great. One paper from JAMA has shown some improvement in a systematic review. So you can go ahead with it. VTI is feasible, but it is difficult. Anirban, I hope it answers your question. So Saurabh, if we do not have any more question, can we call it a day?
Okay, sir.
Sir, I have a question. So what is your take-home message in terms of saline and balance salt solutions?
See, my take-home message is, even I use balance salt solution a lot. And but there is no very clear evidence showing overwhelming benefit of balance salt solution over 0.9%. But when we are anticipating a large volume change, not in terms of 1 liter or 1.5 liter, as has been shown by this Fernando Giampieri in the basic study, or by the Paul Young study, split study, where they use only 2 liters of fluid. But whenever you are exceeding 2.5, which we clearly see in, like recently, I had a lot of cholera cases where we were using 6 liters, 8 liters, 10 liters of fluid. There is probably, I would like to go for a balanced salt solution, clearly, because of the hyperchloremic metabolic acidosis. But despite that, we still have rule for 0.9% saline. For example, say you have a hypovolemic patient who had hypovolemia because of profound vomiting. So you have a metabolic alkalosis because of loss of chloride. What will you give? It is 0.9% saline. If you have a patient with hypovolemic hyponatremia, what do you give? You'll give 0.9% saline. If you are posted in Andaman, which I was posted in Andaman and Nicobar Island as a naval officer, and I didn't have any other solution than 0.9%. What will you give? Will you leave the patient like this? No, I will give 0.9% saline. What about the drug diluents? 0.9% saline is still the most commonly used drug diluent in intensive care unit everywhere. Finally, what about our patients with traumatic brain injury and stroke? The plasmalide or Ringal lactate has got a effective osmolality. I mean, the effective osmolality is the osmolality in the body temperature. That is around 257, which is grossly hypotonic. Plasmalide has got a effective osmolality around 270. Again, it is hypotonic. Whereas saline has got a calculated osmolality of 308 and a effective osmolality of 287 in body temperature. So I would like to give saline over plasmalide or Ringal lactate in traumatic brain injury or patients who have got a possibility of raised intracranial pressure. But I am doing a study right now on sterophundine, which is another balanced salt solution for Bebron, which has got an effective osmolality around 300 or 290, I don't remember exactly, versus 0.9% saline. Maybe sterophundine, but till the time some other study is published, it will be difficult for me to tell. Till that time, if someone asks me which fluid to be given for resuscitation of traumatic brain injury, I'll say 0.9% saline. I hope it answers your question, Dr. Rathi.
Thank you.
We have a lot of more questions, Saurabh.
Yes,
what
sir.
do we do?
Yeah, let's answer these questions. It's nice, interesting. It's an interesting questions.
So we still see occasional use of DNS, 5% dextrose with 0.9% saline. Has it any utility in? Oh, we have more questions about. After Vicar ICU, I have started using 150 millicurrent sodium bicarbonate with 1 liter of D5 in acidotic septic shock patients with AKI. Does it sound like a good idea, sir? Of course, need to keep an eye on potassium and glucose. Anyone would like to? Kamal, you would like to answer this question? You have got a very fascination for renal AKI patients. Dr. Sodhi?
Sorry, sir, I had to.
Yeah. What an interesting question. Question here is, after Beaker ICU, that study where they started this polar bicarb solution. I have started using 150 milligram sodium bicarbonate with 1 liter of D5 in acidotic septic shock patients with AKI. Does it sound like a good idea? Of course, need to keep an eye on potassium and glucose. So this was the question by Dr. Anirban Bhattacharya. Would you like to answer this question?
Sir, I personally have not used, and I will not be very enthusiastic to go in for this using D5 along with sodium bicarbonate. Yes, studies have shown, but personally, because already why give D5 being a hypotonic thing, and why go in for more of dextrose once the patient is critically ill, patient is into septic shock, having already must be into hyperglycemia. But prevention, yes, it has shown, but I have personally not used So you can be, I think, a better person to answer this.
Sorry, nahi beta.
I-
Hello, everyone.
No, Dr.
Okay,
Anirban is there.
Anirban, I just would like to add one thing. This sodium bicarbonate, forget about this bicarbonate. Bicarbonate is not causing anything. Bicarbonate is just getting metabolized to carbon dioxide. It is the sodium component of the sodium bicarbonate which is increasing your strong ion difference. That increase in the strong ion difference is actually producing alkalosis. So Beaker ICU is not a great study, and we still do not have any clear idea whether we should use sodium bicarbonate. I completely agree with Dr. Sodhi that we still do not have data. I think using this sodium bicarbonate and 5% dextrose can only increase your risk of infection because you are mixing these fluids in a septic shock patient. I still do not have, I don't know whether it is clearly going to show any benefit.
Sorry, my
think-
connection got slowed. I could
Oh,
not.
great.
Yeah.
Ritesh, we are happy to see you back. So
Yeah.
would you like to answer this question? We still see professional use of DNS. Has it any utility in clinical practice or should it be banned?
Absolutely no. There is no fluids like DNS in either fluid resuscitation or ongoing maintenance fluid. If you need to correct sugar, then you can additionally give 25% or 50% dextrose. There is no role of maintenance DNS. And as far as it is not a fluid for calorie, it is never a fluid for calorie. So please don't give DNS as a routine fluid.
I absolutely agree with Dr. Ritesh, except there is always an exception in medicine, except in patients with traumatic brain injury where you are unable to give fluid as maintenance fluid. So DNS can be an option as a maintenance fluid, not for resuscitation. So this can be the only.
Yeah. So
Otherwise, no.
It should not be used as routine. I mean to say.
Correct. So
Even in TBI, why use DNS as a maintenance also?
okay. So again, the question is osmolarity comes into the picture. So you have an effective osmolarity of DNS is again around 287 milliequivalent per liter. And as a maintenance fluid, we all know we have to maintain apart from the fluid, we need to give a little bit of dextrose. We need to give a little bit of sodium, 1 to 2 milligrams, though DNS has got a high sodium, 1 to 2 milligrams per kg body weight per day, and potassium of around 1 to 2 milligrams per kg body weight per day, apart from the maintenance fluid requirement. So if you give we have option of giving hypo-oncotic fluid or iso-oncotic or slightly hyper-oncotic fluid. So if you want to go for a hypo-oncotic fluid, normally majority of our patients we give half DNS or maybe 1/4 quarter DNS, or maybe we give Isolite M. Majority of the patients who requires an ISO maintenance fluid at all. But what about the patients with traumatic brain injury or patients with possible risk of rising intracranial pressure? In those patients, we have to give a fluid which is closer isotonic.
Okay.
But as soon as possible, we should get rid of these also and start the RT feed. That's the best option. That's the best fluid. Give intravenous enteral
Why
feeding.
give?
But till that time, DNS probably is the only answer we have as of now. But there is a solution from Dexter, which is not available, but it's available in Europe. I don't remember its name. That may be an option in future. ये लोग हमारे पास तो लेके नहीं आते हैं क्योंकि हमारे यहाँ पे बिकते नहीं है ना सारे, अभी भी सलाह नहीं देते. So if there is no more question, Saurabh, with your permission, can we stop this session?
Okay, sir.
Thank you so much. Thank you everyone, each and everyone. Thank you, Dr. Saurabh and Reshma ma'am for inviting all of us to be a part of this great discussion. Thank you very much and all the best.
Bye.
Good night, everyone.
Thank you, all of you. Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.